Well, good afternoon. Welcome. Buenos dias. Bienvenue. We're really happy to have you join us today, both our live audience and those who are joining us virtually. It means a lot to have these important conversations, so thank you so much for being here. I'm Dr. Laura Telemonte. I'm a chair of our Gender Equity Task Force, and I'm a statewide senator. Today, we have special guests for a women's leadership workshop, When Women Lead, Title IX, and a CSU Culture of Care with Interim Chancellor Jolene Kester and Board of Trustees Chair Wenda Fong. I really want to thank them for agreeing to actually it was their idea, to come out to a CSU campus, right? And so to really bring the human element to these difficult conversations. Right now I want to begin with the acknowledgement of the land that Dominguez Hills is fortunate enough to call home, and these are the lands of the Tongva peoples. And so if we can just take a moment, please recognize and honor the Tongva people and the indigenous people on the lands in which you inhabit today. We acknowledge that the land on which we are gathered here today is the home and traditional land belonging to the Tongva Nation. Today, we come with respect and gratitude for the Tongva people who still consider themselves the caretakers of these lands. It is through their examples that we are reminded of our greater responsibility to take care of Mother Earth and to take care of one another. And with that, it is my pleasure to introduce the 11th president of California State University, Dominguez Hills, Dr. Thomas Parham. Let me just say a few words of welcome. Go ahead, please, please, please. All right. Dr. Parham began his tenure here as president in 2018. He came to us from California, at University of California, Irvine, where he held several leadership positions over 33 years. He was vice chancellor for student affairs, that's his last position, and always an adjunct faculty mentor. In addition to his leadership, Dr. Parham has sustained a licensed clinical practice as a licensed psychologist with more than 40 years as both a scholar and practitioner. His research focus is in the area of psychological neuroscience, specifically on identity development, African psychology, and multicultural counseling. In addition to writing over 45 journal articles and book chapters, he is also the author of 2 books, Psychological Storms, The African American Struggle for Identity, and Counseling Persons of African Descent, Raising the Bar of Practitioner Competence. He has received numerous awards. I'm just going to mention 2 of the most recent ones today. Okay. A Community Service Award from the Greater LA African American Chamber of Commerce in May 2022, and the 40th Anniversary Salute and Scholarship Award from LA's Bridge Builders Foundation in June 2022. Under President Parham's leadership, we have had the good fortune to open 2 new instructional buildings, one of which we are in today, the Innovation and Instruction Building. We have completed as a campus a new strategic plan known as Going Far Together. We have also seen the work supported for an anti-racism task force and a gender equity task force, as well as establishing a policy, a presidential memo, our gender equity principles. We thank President Parham for his strong and continuing leadership and for his voice and representation of Cal State University, Dominguez Hills. Welcome, Dr. Parham.
One more time, if you would, for Chair Telemonte. Let me say good afternoon. Let me say good afternoon to the rest of you. Good afternoon. Thank you for that gracious but way too long introduction. The best thing I do in my life as a professional is surround myself with great people, provide just a little bit of strategic vision, get the heck up out their way, and let them do what they do. This forum today is an example, right, of that kind of leadership that you'll see. I want to add my voice to the chorus of those that say welcome to our students, welcome to our staff, welcome to our faculty, welcome to our community guests and others who are here. It is a pleasure. I want to say a particular welcome to the chair of our Board of Trustees, Wenda Fong. I want you to know that even before chair, we have not had a stronger advocate or more vocal supporter of this president and this campus than Chair Wenda Fong. Chair Fong, thank you. And even as we've had some changes, I first met our chancellor way back in the day when our own youngest child had an opportunity to study and work with her at Cal State University Northridge and learned a lot from her. But we are delighted that she is at the helm of the system that is in need of a steady hand and some courageous leadership. And I can't thank you enough for being here today, for being a part of this symposium. Well, if you would, our Chancellor, Dr. Jolene Kester. In welcoming our guests, I'm reminded that when women lead is a contemporary topic, but not a new phenomenon. Let me say that again. When women lead is a contemporary topic for the day, but not a new phenomenon. I was sitting in my office this morning and I had on my mind the mindset of Queen Hatshepsut. How many know Queen Hatshepsut? So we got to go all the way back to the African continent, to the ancient Kemetic people. The queen of the Pharaoh Tutmosis II, who, when he died early in his reign, assumed the mantle of leadership and one of the very few women to rule Egypt as Pharaoh. Now, if you believe the stories about Queen Hatshepsut, who was very instrumental in trade, who took over to command an army and military even in the midst of the invasion by the Hyksos, if you look at the temples and other things that she was able to build that are pretty phenomenal. She had a pretty phenomenal reign for what is estimated to be about 21 years and became ruler at 29 years of age. Pretty phenomenal. When women lead is a contemporary topic, but not a new phenomenon. And so today we are here in the shadows of people like Queen Hatshepsut to talk about what we think are some very important issues of our time in leadership of women. I am proud, in fact, of the strides that we have made not only in the broader CSU system, who several years ago crossed the threshold so that the majority of presidents in the California State University, which is the largest system of public higher education in all of America, we take a backseat to nobody in the work we do. The majority of the campuses were led by women. That sounds like an applause line to me. And we thank former Chancellor Tim White for his leadership and guidance in that, as well as the Board of Trustees who, right, had the wisdom to be able to select each of those folk. And so as we continue that leadership, I think this campus has also benefited from, right, that continued leadership that is there. And so as we have even made changes in our own administrative cabinet, as well as in our academic infrastructure with our deans, you'll find, in fact, a majority of those have, in fact, been appointments of women. Not because they were women, but because they were excellent leaders, because they were excellent scholars, because they were competent people who were committed to the mission of California State University, Dominguez Hills. Now, as I prepare to take my seat and introduce our next speaker, I'm reminded today about what's most important and what you'll hear from our two guests. In that space, I'm thinking about a text written by one of my heroes beyond Brother Malcolm was Brother Martin. And in his text, Strength to Love, he talked about a formula, right, that folk had to be able to engage in to be able to move forward, and I think to lead. And this formula represents, I think, our two distinguished guests today. Because Martin argued that you had to have a tough mind, but a tender heart. A tough mind, but a tender heart. And that is, in fact, one of the critical elements of that feminine energy that allows us to be able to navigate our pathways to productivity and success in the way that we do when women lead. So please expect to hear some of the tough-mindedness and tender-heartedness today, right, that'll come from our two distinguished guests. So one more time, if you would, we are thankful for our two guests, Chancellor Kester and Board Chair Wenda Fong. And now it is my pleasure to introduce one of the latest additions. She's not quite the new kid on the block no more because, right, she's been here a little while. But she is one of those phenomenal women leaders who has just come and taken the campus by storm. And part of why we recruited her and are so glad to have her is because of the leadership that she provides, the competence that she exudes, and just the strength and courage, but also the student-centered focus and campus-centered focus that she brings to the work. We waited a long time through several searches to find her, but we refused to do it conveniently because we had to get this one right. Ladies and gentlemen, she is our brand new Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. Please say hello to Dr. Bobby Porter.
Thank you, Dr. Parham. Thank you, Dr. Talamonte. So they both stood at the front of the room. I wanted to hide behind the microphone stand over here, but they did it so well. I'm going to take a shot at doing it. So welcome, everyone. So happy to see your faces. It's not very often that we get to come together in person, but I love that we're also able to leverage technology and stream our colleagues into our event today. So again, I am Dr. Bobby Porter. I use she, her pronouns, and I serve as the Vice President and Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer here at Dominguez Hills. For those of you who haven't met, I've been on campus since July 1, so give me a little time. I'll make my way to you, I promise. But today, I have the pleasure of introducing our panelists today. But before I do so, I want to provide just a little bit of context to our conversation today. So please excuse me as I read my remarks because there are some important points in here that I want to make sure that I hit. The context I will provide is specifically around our discussion today, which is all about Title IX, and most importantly to us in Toro Nation, a culture of care. So for those of you who may not be familiar with the history of Title IX or the legislation itself, 50 years ago, President Nixon signed Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972 into law. Title IX ensures that male and female identified students and employees in educational settings, such as schools and universities like ours, are protected against sex and gender-based discrimination, harassment, and violence. Since its enactment, the CSU has remained committed to ensuring a safe working and learning environment at every campus. In fact, in 2014, the CSU was the first university system in the country to appoint a dedicated system-wide Title IX compliance officer to actively address issues related to sex discrimination and sexual violence. Here at CSU Dominguez Hills, we have the Office of Equity and Inclusion. I hope you've heard of it, and if you haven't, just give us a little bit of time. We will make our way around. But this office, which is within my portfolio, is dedicated to creating and sustaining an educational and working environment that is free of sexual misconduct, dating violence, domestic violence, and stalking. In recent months, the system's practices around sexual harassment and discrimination have come under intense scrutiny. But what my experience as a career diversity practitioner has taught me is that through scrutiny and diversity crisis, we can, or those issues can lead to impactful change, which is what we have seen in our systems leaders. This is what we've seen them do in recent months. Through our system leaders' increased commitment to end sexual harassment and discrimination in all of its forms, they are upholding their commitment in part by assessing the effectiveness of our collective existing educational programs, resources, and supports. In March of this year, the CSU hired what we're calling them the COSIN folks, but they hired COSIN O'Connor's Institutional Response Group to conduct a system-wide assessment of the CSU's implementation of its Title IX and discrimination, harassment, and retaliation programs. But really, although this is an assessment of a program, it's really an assessment, or it delves into the question of what is the culture of care and inclusion in the CSU. So with this question in mind, this assessment that they were first hired in March, but began their efforts this past summer, this assessment evaluates the strengths, challenges, and resources of each institution in the CSU. This assessment is meant to measure statewide, at the system level, the opportunities for coordination, alignment, oversight, and efficiency. So Dr. Porter, why are you telling us all of this? Well, again, the review started in summer, but here at Dominguez Hills, our review is coming up. Out of the 23 institutions, the system is going around and they are assessing a number of aspects of our climate and culture of inclusion and care. They're assessing the infrastructure and resources at both the system office and the campuses. They're assessing our training, education, and prevention programming for students, staff, faculty, and board members at each of the campuses, as well as the chancellor's office. They're looking at the lifespan of Title IX and DHR reports, what it takes to go from intake to resolution, and most importantly, from where I sit as a diversity practitioner, they're assessing the campus culture and climate regarding Title IX and DHR issues. So like I said, these reviews have been underway since this summer. For us at Dominguez Hills, our review is scheduled for January 17th through the 19th in 2023. On those dates, and this has been the practice at all of the CSUs, the COSIN O'Connor Institutional Response Group will come to our campus to meet with campus community members, stakeholders, and implementers whose work intersects with Title IX and DHR. It is important that you all know that this visit is intended to be collaborative and to generate an understanding of how we at Dominguez Hills and on a broader scale all across the system implement Title IX and DHR and how and what is that impact on our campus community. Last point about Dominguez Hills before I go to our introductions. In the spirit of collaboration, my office is hosting an informational session regarding our campus review. I'm holding this event next Tuesday via Zoom. That's December 6th. It's at 2:30. Please, please, please join us so we can go into more detail and what you can expect in our campus review. Now, with all of that context provided, and thank you for allowing me just a little time to talk about this important assessment for our campus community, providing that context, and that was all around where we are with the culture of care on our campus, on a broader scale across the system, and specific to Title IX, I will get out of your way and bring up the people that you want to hear from the most. So our panelists today, as Dr. Parham has already noted, is our interim chancellor for the CSU, Dr. Jolene Kester, and the chair of the CSU Board of Trustees, Ms. Wenda Fong. So starting with Dr. Kester, she began her tenure as the CSU's interim chancellor on May 1st of this year. She has enjoyed a distinguished career in the CSU that spans nearly 30 years. Prior to her role as interim chancellor, Dr. Kester served as president of CSU Northridge from 2000 to 2011. During her tenure as president, she successfully led CSUN through a period of unprecedented growth, with the student population increasing by more than 25%. This period of growth also coincided with dramatic improvements in student success, including significant gains in graduation and retention rates. Not one for a quiet retirement, Dr. Kester imparted her wisdom for higher education leadership as a senior consultant for Askew Consulting since 2011, before being called to serve as our interim chancellor earlier this year. Please welcome Interim Chancellor Kester. Please also welcome the chair of the Board of Trustees for the CSU, Ms. Wenda Fong. Chair Fong began her 40-plus career in television as the producer and host of her own live talk show series in LA. Ms. Fong is the producer and director of music and variety specials, award shows, reality specials, sitcoms, talk shows, documentaries, PSAs, and live events. Very impressive. She holds the dual distinction as being the first person of color and first woman to have produced the Emmy Awards. She also served as the first executive director of creative development of diversity and vice president of diversity development at Fox Broadcasting Company. Chair Fong has launched productions across the United States and around the world, including China, Canada, Europe, and Africa. Please, please, please give a warm CSU DH welcome to our panelists today and Dr. Talamante.
Thank you so much, VP Porter, for that very, very important overview of the work that we're going to be discussing today, as well as those wonderful introductions. I just want to let everybody know in our viewing audience, as well as our live audience, that we have two co-organizers of the Women's Leadership Workshops. If you wouldn't mind just standing for a moment, Dr. Martinez. Michelle Martinez is our McNair Scholars. Our McNair Scholars Program Director, as well as Dr. Kitty Fortner from the College of Education, and from Graduate Education. So remembering that our university supports both undergraduates and graduate students. So thank you both for helping to organize today. They're also going to be taking the questions. So those of you in the live audience, you were given a note card when you came in. If you would circulate any questions you have during the event to Dr. Michelle Martinez. And if we don't get to your question today, we'll correlate those afterwards and then make sure to send them on to the chancellor and the chair. And then for those of you in our virtual audience today, Dr. Kitty Fortner will also be synthesizing questions, and you can email her directly at kfortner@csudh.edu. Okay, with that, I just want to say thank you again. It's really nice to be in person. And this is definitely a topic that we want to humanize, right? So I'm going to start with Chair Fong today, and you're the 34th chair of the Board of Trustees. Claudia Hampton was our first female chair of the Board of Trustees, and you're our 7th female chair. But you're also our first Asian American person to chair the board. As we heard earlier, right, you've led the way in the entertainment industry, first person of color and first woman to have produced the Emmy Awards, a trailblazer, right? You have been a trailblazer in terms of diversity development with the work that you did at Fox Broadcasting Company, and part of that work was to increase the employment of diverse writers, directors, producers, and actors, among other accomplishments, to increase the visibility of Asian American actors, writers, producers, and directors. Please tell us about this leadership journey, your selection to the Board of Trustees, first as vice chair, now as the chair, and any unique vision and philosophy that you would like to share with us today at this particular moment.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Talamante, for having the interim chancellor and me here. And thank you so much. It's so wonderful to see all of you here. I do have one correction in that when I was at the Fox Broadcasting Company, my goal was to increase the number of diverse people as well as women in front of and behind the camera. So my leadership journey, I must start with my grandparents. All four of my grandparents came from China over 120 years ago to Meiguo, America, which literally translates to beautiful country, the land of opportunity. And the reason why they came was because of the transformational power of higher education. I often heard my mother say that the reason why my grandparents came to this country and sacrificed was so that their children and grandchildren would never have to lift anything heavier than a pencil. I'm sure that many of you can relate to that with your own families. My mother's family settled in San Francisco. My mom was actually born on Grant Avenue in Chinatown. My father's parents settled in Sacramento, where I was born and raised along with my 4 siblings. Sadly, my father died when I was in the 1st grade, so my mother raised all 5 of us. Again, with the knowledge that we had the opportunity to go to college. So when I finally went to college, I soon discovered that I did not know what I wanted to be when I grew up. I don't know if any of our students have similar, I see some heads nodding. It was terrifying for me. But when I was in high school, because of the stories that I had heard from my mother about the racism and prejudice that my grandparents faced, that my parents endured, and that I, along with my siblings, experienced, it inspired me to start it was actually the Oriental Service Club in high school in 1968. We were not using the word Asian yet. So when I finally went to college, I found Asian American Studies. And I realized this was an opportunity to turn my passion into action. And I thought that I would work for the community. The summer before my senior year, one of my professors in Asian American Studies suggested that I audition for a talk show as a public affairs program that was highlighting the community in Los Angeles. So my life took a huge left turn, and I found television. And it was the greatest gift of my life. And I was able, after being on camera for several years, I realized that as a woman in the 70s, if I was fortunate to have a 20-plus year career, that by the time I turned 40, that I would probably be let go because I would be deemed too old. And I looked around and I thought, well, who is the person that has the control? That's the producer. That's what I want to be. So I started at the bottom of the ladder and I worked myself up. And I became a producer, a director, creative executive. And the interesting thing is being a producer is something that prepared me for this position as chair of the board of trustees for the CSU. Because as a producer, you need to be collaborative. You need to be creative. You need to be innovative. You need to have courage. You need to have compassion. You need to round up a group of people with different talents and help them be the best that they can be so that you can build a production that is within budget and also will gain the eyes, the ratings of a large audience. So it's all about coming together, creating a product, and being a leader that can support, inspire, and have the vision to take the project or whatever you're working on. So all of this led me to being appointed by Governor Brown to be a trustee for the CSU. And that was in March of 2018. And it is the greatest honor and privilege of my life. And I think about my grandparents because, as I said, they came to this country because of the transformational power of higher education. So can you imagine how they would feel, how my parents would feel, if they knew that their granddaughter was the chair of the board of the greatest system of higher education in the nation?
Thank you so much, Chair Fong. That is inspirational, and it resonates for, I'm sure, everybody here. Many of us come from migrant backgrounds, and our families and their hopes for us. And so thank you for leading the way for future generations to have the same opportunities at transformation. Chancellor Kester, you served as the second woman you're currently the second woman to be the chancellor of California State University. Our first chancellor, female chancellor, was Ann Reynolds. In your leadership at Cal State Northridge, you were the fourth president, but their second president, right? So also trailblazing in your leadership journey. Please tell us about that journey, how that led you to both the presidency and now coming out of retirement at a very crucial moment, right? Where your leadership is much appreciated. Tell us about the journey, your unique vision, and the philosophy that you bring to leadership at this moment.
I'm the perfect example of somebody who has never had a career goal in her life. I actually, that's not completely accurate. I did have one. I went back to get a PhD after some years of working in international education, because I wanted to direct an international education office at a university. And it is the only career goal I've had, and I failed at it. I've never done that. I say that because it's reflective as well of the time in which I was born, and I may comment on that a little bit more later. But it was a time and a place in which women, young girls, then growing women and older women didn't have career goals. I was never taught to want to be anything. I was taught to use my God-given talents in the best possible way. And every time I say that, I can hear my mother's voice, because it was her voice who said that frequently. So I came to the CSU in 1983 as an assistant professor in communication studies. I came not knowing what the mission of the CSU was. I was fleeing the University of Missouri in Columbia, and if any of you are from Missouri, my apologies, but I didn't like it. I didn't like living there. I didn't like living in that community, but it was also a university that was very much governed by the tradition of a white patriarchal society. And there was no place for someone like me there. So I came to Sacramento sort of out of desperation. It was the place that offered me the job and that had 1 million people living in the metropolitan area. That was a big criterion for me. But it was a place that allowed me to have activity, potency, to be engaged. And that's what I wanted. And it allowed me very quickly to align who I was and what I cared about with the mission of the university itself. So I quickly became involved in all kinds of activities and culminated my career there as chief academic officer and provost, something I never aspired to be, but it sort of gradually, incrementally became something to do. And it was at that point that people talked to me about being a president, and I thought, ugh, sort of it was more yuck, right? Because I wasn't sure I wanted to do that kind of work. But for a variety of reasons that are more personal than anything, I decided to go ahead, and I was able to serve as president of Cal State University Northridge, which has to, for any of you who have had the opportunity to imagine being the leader of a vibrant, meaningful, consequential institution, was just a wonderful, wonderful experience to me. So, but I did that for 11 and a half years, and then it was time not to do it anymore. So I became a consultant, as Bobby talked about earlier in the introduction. And here I am, as serving as interim chancellor, something I never thought I would do. I'd never aspired to it. I mean, so it's all, much of what it is I've done is a surprise, but driven by a couple of sets of values. One is I believe in public higher education. I believe in education because I know how it affected me and changed my life. Because I believe fundamentally in a multicultural, multiracial, multi-ethnic, multilingual society. At my core, my academic interest was in intercultural communication. And that is what the CSU represents, all of that vision, all of that future. Because as well as a leader, I start with values. And the fundamental value that drives what it is I do is respect. And if I'm going to wake up in the middle of the night and worry, it's usually because in the middle of the night I realize that I didn't treat someone with respect. So it's simple, it sounds pretty simplistic, but nevertheless, that's where I start the leadership journey from. And yes, this is a pretty consequential time for the CSU, and that is why I am here. It is why I said yes, because I care fundamentally about what the CSU means to this state and to the future of the state, but also, frankly, of this country that I too love.
Thank you so much. The CSU has been the most important part of my own personal journey and growth. And I really appreciate you ending with that respect, right? And how much it means to also check ourselves, to know when we didn't do our best, and to take steps then to do our best, right? And reach out to folks that we may have treated in ways that were unintentional but had consequences, right, for them. So, well, we're going to hit some more difficult notes now, so thank you for sharing this journey today. Chancellor Kester, we're going to talk about some words that you sent out in June of 2022. And it was really a very important message, right, at this time of crisis around CSU and Title IX system issues, things that had become more and more public since Chancellor Castro resigned, and these have not been easy for anyone, right? But I think that many like myself were really heartened by your message. It meant something as a woman taking this journey to the CSU, experiences along the way, experiences within the system that are very good, but also at times really just challenge us to, are we meant to be here? Is the system for us? And I always believe that it is. But you talked about, quote, facing gender-based discrimination, especially sexually inappropriate behavior, physical intimidation. But it was that respect that you ended with, right? How we treat one another is at the core values of our system. And I know that you want to help us do better. Would you share some of how that journey has, that particular personal journey, that difficult part of that we don't talk about every day, has helped shape your leadership for our issues today.
So let me set the personal context. I'm going to be 75 in February. That's important because you have to roll the clock back a long way. And many of you have no idea what that clock really looks like and the reality of the world. I grew up in a town of 250 people, an agricultural community in rural Minnesota, of German Lutheran parents. All of those things are relevant. The eldest of 5 kids, uneducated parents, father a mechanic, working class. I was an anomaly. I was, from little on, pretty vocal. And those of you who've known me a long time, my family and everybody else says, of course, right? I was vocal and I was opinionated and I stood out. Didn't quite know why, because as a child and as a beginning teen and a teenager in high school, I didn't understand it. But I wasn't supposed to act that way because that wasn't the set of expectations for girls. I did have the privilege of being white, right? But otherwise, I went to a small high school where I did have teachers who helped make growth possible, who helped translate those skills and abilities into something. So in terms of awareness of gender discrimination, gender intimidation, physical intimidation, I was pretty good at repressing most of that through much of my life. Certainly, I have moments now where I look back at relationships with family members, with people in educational institutions. I had an uncle who was been in the military, and he just had disdain for girls. He had 3 boys, and he was dismissive. And I remember with great joy the moment when I could really verbally expose his frailties in front of a large number of other family members. And he later came to me and he said, "Jolene, you embarrass me in front of all of our family." I said, "No, Uncle," I won't say his name, I had a lot of uncles. "No, Uncle, you embarrassed yourself." Right? So there were moments like this along the way. And I think, frankly, there was a naivete in my understanding of the world that allowed me to continue to be who I wanted to be, even in the face of some of the discrimination, some of the closed doors, some of the sexual innuendos, some of the sort of the intimidation that comes along. And I will also say that at a certain point in my adult life, I decided to be aware, but not to try to strike down, as I had done with my uncle. That I chose a different pathway because I began to see what I needed to do sort of as a return on investment. If I was going to belittle someone, if I was going to challenge someone, if I was going to call out their discrimination, there were other consequences that had to be taken into account that I sometimes chose, so I chose to ignore some of the discrimination, the intimidation, etc. And sometimes I would ignore it in that moment, but then I would look for other moments within which to strike or to try to set the table correctly. Let me just also say that I've always looked as an adult like a school teacher. And I say that with pride. I want to say that with pride. But that has also created an asset for me that it's taken a while for me to understand it as an asset. But we underestimate the intellectual prowess, the determination, the fierceness, the incisiveness of school teachers. And in addition to looking like a school teacher, I'm nice, is what people say. Jolene is nice. Jolene smiles, right? And I have repeatedly in my career had people say, whoa, how, are you really going to do that? You're too nice. And I'm quite willing to be nice, but it doesn't mean that I can't make decisions. So, coming to the CSU and the commitment to a culture of care, coming to the CSU at a moment in which the culture of care is important. I've always cared about care. That's a big part of leadership. So it's not anomalous to me, it's not atypical, it's de rigueur, it's required. The world is about people, it's about culture, and leadership needs to be about that as well.
Thank you. I'm going to just go ahead and turn to you now, Chair Fong, in terms of, with a lot of firsts for women, for people of color, yes, it's a celebration, but at the same time, it also speaks to, right, our historical issues with discrimination, with racism, with sexism, and that we still face these today. And if you would share what you feel comfortable sharing from your journey in terms of any of those issues and how it's shaping your leadership today. Thank you.
Besides having, to me, an amazing career in the entertainment industry, I've been fortunate to work with the greatest. But I also had a parallel career in my life, as I had explained to you before, that I had co-founded the Oriental Service Club when I was in high school. When I was in college, I co-founded Asian Americans for Fair Media. And so it was something that I always did throughout my life. It was just part of who I was. So my life was always through the lens of what we call now diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. So as I was working up the ladder in the entertainment industry, I made a concerted effort to, besides clearing my own pathway, because there was nobody before me. I did not know of another Asian person who was working in musical variety television. There were no people of color. When I would walk onto a set, the women that were on the set were generally secretaries, and there were no people of color. And so I had to wend my way through and find myself and create that pathway for me. And one thing that I decided was I was not going to let other people have to do that. I was going to clear that pathway to establish a pipeline of people. And so I became the president of East West Players, the oldest Asian American theater in the United States. I co-founded the Asian American Committee for the Directors Guild of America. And I co-founded in 1991 CAPE, the Coalition of Asian Pacifics in Entertainment, which I'm really proud to say is the oldest, largest, and frankly, the preeminent organization for AAPIs in the entertainment industry. And we've established an incredible writers program, an incredible executive program. Again, all with the intention of creating a pipeline. Also, when I was working in the entertainment industry, I determined and decided that once I had the ability to hire people, I would bring on people that I could train and again get into the pipeline of women and particularly people of color, with the one proviso that they in turn must also help other people. If they didn't want to do that, it'd be you're on your own. So with my leadership, it has been so critical to, as I said, create that pipeline. And so for the CSU, being the chair of the board, working collaboratively has been a goal. And I have to say that, as we all know, this is a critical time for the CSU. And I could not have a greater partner, a greater collaborator than the interim chancellor, Jolene Kester. And even before we could convince her to take on the role, she called me up and she wanted to know what my goals were as chairship when I took over in late May. And it turns out that our goals are identical. And so we are arm in arm, along with the remarkable Board of Trustees, with our remarkable team in the Chancellor's office, our presidents, and everyone down, that we are here to strengthen the CSU. Our goal is to regain the trust and confidence of the CSU internally and externally, to assess and evaluate our system, the Chancellor's office, processes, structures, procedures, policies, and along those lines, key is Title IX. And when we as the CSU and the board faced those terrible incidences, and we as a board called for the assessment, the evaluation of Title IX for all of our 23 universities and the Chancellor's office.
Well, thank you. It's not an easy time to step into these leadership roles, but I'm glad that you two are together to collaborate, and it sounds like a great partnership is forming. I want to share some feedback from a short survey that we did. We held a workshop at the end of October here on campus to get input to help prepare for the event, right? What would people like to know, right, if we have this opportunity to talk with you? And from their feedback, we chose one response that we saw as threads in other responses. So this is in relationship to Title IX and discrimination, harassment, and retaliation issues, DHR is commonly referred to. And so many indicated that they didn't report issues for fear of retaliation or a sense that nothing would change as a result of reporting. And so one respondent brought a number of these elements together. Quote, "In my experience, everything is tied together. Reporting experiences are not valuable as the message is diluted as it's passed from office to office. Reporting allows for administration and HR to get their stuff together to avoid liability for the university. The roots of systemic racism, sexism, and discrimination are the issues. The roots of discriminatory issues are deeper than any supervisor or administrator can or is willing to address." And so, Chair Fong, from the perspective of the Board of Trustees, what are the philosophical underpinnings and frameworks for the assessment that will aid in addressing these systemic issues of racism, sexism, and discrimination? And in your leadership experience, how have you humanized work around such issues and the fears that can be associated with reporting racism, sexism, and discrimination?
As an exemplar of our collaborative partnership, I'm going to step in and take that question. And then we'll let Laura ask the chair the question, another question subsequently. And I'm going to jump in because I am more the academic, right? That's where my roots are. Philosophical underpinnings, theory, were part of who I was. I'm now pretty steeped in the administrative world. But let me just jump in here on this particular issue. First, Bobby did a great job in providing a historical context for Title IX. Title IX began a long time ago. When I started as a president, the emphasis was on gender equity in intercollegiate athletics. It led me to eliminate Division I football when I was president at Cal State Northridge, which was quite an unusual experience. And I was not an athlete, and I was a school teacher president, right? So it was an interesting experience. For me, Title IX as a president was only about gender equity in intercollegiate athletics. The Dear Colleagues letter that was issued from the U.S. Department of Education in 2011 changed that landscape. So 2011, it is now 2022, almost 2023. During that time, there have been two, now soon to be a third, set of standards around how Title IX on university campuses, in universities, are supposed to be implemented. We're talking about a relatively short period of time in which universities are being asked to perform virtually every single aspect of the consideration of discrimination and violence, intimidation related to sexism. So the frame here first is that while this is a critically important issue because it affects people, there is a limited period of time that universities have had within which to develop appropriate structures, processes, and then communities and cultures around it. The second thing I want to say is that we universities exist in a cultural milieu, a context. And the world that we are in pretty clearly exhibits frequently racism, sexism, discrimination, homophobia, a variety of other kinds of just shockingly unacceptable responses to the diversity of human beings. Our universities don't have walls around them. That outside world comes in. And so, yes, we have all of those characteristics here as well. So I've said a couple of things. Time to build structures, processes, recognition that the world around us invades our world and space. Third issue here is around the sense of retaliation if you report, if you complain, if you say things. And you know, one of the things that I would have liked in order to be better able to respond to this question is to talk about who people are afraid of. Because in my experience, my personal experience, now understand I said I was naive some of the time, but it was frequently the others around me who somehow suggested that I couldn't do what I wanted to do. I mean, that was one of the reasons that I didn't want to be at the University of Missouri, because older European American faculty members would say to me, well, you can't teach that course, you can't do that, or know your place, Missy, essentially. So, you know, all of those elements are part of this. I think we have to have a couple of words that we use here for these philosophical underpinnings. We know what's right. We need to be guided by what's right. 2, we have to be tenacious. 3, we have to be steadfast in that tenaciousness. And I don't see those as the same thing. And 4th, we're going to have to be courageous and bold along the way, in the context of a world that is constantly judging us. So let me just stop there.
Thank you. And I do want to say that there were also responses of people who had positive experiences, right, with our Title IX folks. But it's important, I think, to get at those who don't, right, and those who just see a system that they can't believe in yet, for a myriad of reasons. This isn't just on our campus, but in the system, right? Chair Fong, let me turn to you. Part of the message that we received from Chancellor Kester in communication in June was that we can't just check boxes, right? This just can't be an exercise. It has to be meaningful. It has to be transformative. So, our survey respondents noted that a culture of care starts with trust. And so I'd like to ask you about your vision of a culture of care for the system.
Well, I think, because we're talking about Title IX, and in response to the Title IX issues that we at the CSU have been facing, as I said, the Board of Trustees tasked the Chancellor's Office to have an assessment and evaluation. And we brought in an outside party, probably the finest Title IX people in the nation, to evaluate all 23 of our universities and the Chancellor's Office. And they have been to 17 of our 23 universities. As Bobby was saying, Dominguez Hills will be in that process January 17th, 18th, and 19th, and I encourage all of the Dominguez Hills community to participate in that. With the assessment that is being done, they are interviewing the key stakeholders, also having small focus groups as well. So, that is one of the things that we as the Board of Trustees are trying to do in terms of regaining trust and confidence. We have turned an assessment upon ourselves of the board, and we have done an assessment, and we are moving forward to strengthen not only the board so that we can be effective, and also so that we can be strategic to look forward on how we can strengthen to be more effective, to build the CSU in a way that will positively affect the generations of students that will follow. Again, it is all about the transformational power of higher education. So the Chancellor and I, along with the board and the Chancellor's Office, had been working so diligently on a long, long list of issues and things that we wish to do, some of which we will only be able to start with our tenure. But the goal is to use, what I have done in my career in the entertainment industry to clear a pathway, to create a pipeline. That is what we are trying to do with the CSU.
Thank you. And I want to end our portion here with one last question for the Chancellor, and then we'll turn to our moderators, Dr. Kitty Fortner and Dr. Michelle Martinez, for some questions from our audience today. What do you think is necessary to make real change, to alleviate any fears of retaliation, to change the culture from one where compliance and fear of lawsuits seems to drive decisions and, appears, maybe, that may not be the whole story, right? But when it appears that way, we have to do something about it. And where the roots of sexism and racism are entrenched in society, politics, and higher education, as you astutely observed, what can be done to create a CSU community where men, women, and non-binary folks, what Chair Fong highlights is the collective we, so that everyone feels equally responsible, motivated, and engaged in the necessary open and difficult dialogue in order to achieve our mission. And what you've emphasized, Chancellor Kester, as our, quote, unique opportunity to fundamentally change the way we treat people, our diverse and talented students, our world-class faculty and staff, our partners and friends.
There's a temptation in the academy, and there's a temptation in other institutions as well, to approach change as a task force or a set of processes that get completed, and then we check the box. We say it's done. Clearly, on the goals as Laura described them, of a university that reflects a society described in the ways with the words that she's offered to us. That doesn't happen by completing a task force, completing a set of assessments. We're talking about a set of goals in terms of human behavior that unfortunately seems to have eluded human beings throughout much of our history. That doesn't mean that we don't try, because we know what's right. So what I would say is the pathway forward for all of us has to be to focus on bringing ourselves together. It's pretty easy in this context to look to administration, to both blame and occasionally praise. It's more blame than praise most of the time, right? That's sort of what goes with it. But to look to administration as having the efficacy, the potency. And that is true. There is some of that in being an administrator in a university. But administrators cannot do this alone. To achieve the kind of change that we want to have happen in our university, it means that each of us becomes accountable. And we become accountable individually, but we also become accountable through the constituencies and their groups that represent us. We come together around commonly agreed upon desired changes. And then we come at it, we come at it, we come at it. When I started as the interim chancellor, we were talking about the Cozen O'Connor work. We had just kicked it off. But it was very clear to me that they could give us a sense of what we were doing well, what we might not be doing well, where we needed to put more resources, and all of that they are going to tell us. But that is an empty to-do list unless we also are able to mobilize the rest of us as individuals, with the values that we want to have in order to get the changes that we need to have. So that, for me, is the culture of care. Now, I do think leaders make a difference, right? Administrators make a difference. Other leaders in other segments of our universities make a difference because they do help shape the culture. So what I would say to you is that the leadership in the CSU, the leadership on your campus, is committed to shaping that culture in a better way going forward. And so we simply ask the rest of you to help shape as well with us. This is not a singular individual event. This is a collective effort.
Thank you. I really appreciate the collective we, leadership from the top down, from the bottom up, sideways, in the middle, right? We're all leaders in our own ways. And so I want to turn now to two of our other leaders on campus who have helped with co-organizing the Women's Leadership Workshops for some questions from the audience.
Yes, so I really appreciate this time. It's been really wonderful. This person is one of our online audience, and she says, thank you, first of all. Thank you to everyone for bringing this to CSUDH. And she says this has been a great opportunity to hear from Interim Chancellor Kester and Chair Fong about the perspectives regarding CSU leaders and importance system-wide. Her question is, she's got two questions. The first one says, what are the main challenges facing women in the CSU system, and what are some effective strategies that they can use? And then the second question says, how does a CSU culture of care influence women empowerment, mentoring, and leadership in public higher education?
Sure. I'm thinking a little bit here. I think the answer to the first question is I don't know. Because for a couple of reasons. One is I feel uncomfortable about speaking for all of the women in all of the various positions or roles that they have in the CSU. So I have some hesitancy about jumping in. And that hesitancy is compounded by the fact that I spent 10 years not part of the official organization. I think the latter question is more direct, that if in the CSU we can stay focused on what it is we're trying to accomplish with our culture of care, that we become a model that influences, can be emulated, infiltrates, that becomes the touchstone for much of what else can happen in the society at large. One of the wonderful things about the CSU, and I say it all the time, the CSU's world is California. And you know that when you see all of the ways in which the leadership, the faculty, the staff from any one of our universities is fully engaged in their community. So there is a direct consequence and a direct shaping.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. This is from our audience. This is from a student who had to leave to class. In cultivating a culture of care, we want to be a student, faculty-centric university. The culture and identity centers allow this. How are the CSUs cultivating and preserving culture and identity centers? At CSU-DH, I as a student feel as though the culture and identity centers are being neglected by the university. This is illustrated by consistent student advocacy and the postponement of a Women's Resource Center grand opening, which was supposed to be today.
Well, let me see. This is probably another one where I would be better off just keeping my mouth quiet rather than opening it. Let me also provide a bit of a historical framework. When I left CSUN in 2011, I think we had 2, maybe 3 cultural identity centers. The salience, the power of an identity center was just beginning to be relevant, and universities were just beginning to recognize and create space, structure, resources, leadership for those efforts. So again, for me, there's a contextual aspect to this that's really important. And I would say that there's also, I understand that if you are part of a group that wants a cultural identity center and you're not getting it as quickly as you want it, that there's easy judgment to be made that says that it isn't as important. But I don't necessarily think that that judgment is always accurate. Now, I'm not going to get involved in the work in the issues at DH. That's for your president and his leadership team to be involved with. But I think I would want to say there's all over the CSU a great deal of belief in the salience of cultural identity centers, of their important place on our university campuses. So philosophically, fundamentally, and also financially and structurally, there's been a great deal of support.
And I just say, somebody said this to me earlier, that these conversations are important, right? And these hard questions are important. And our new VP, Bobby Porter for Equity and Inclusion, started something called Conversations That Matter. Right? We just had that about 2 weeks ago, and that doesn't solve things, but just having the conversations, being able to ask questions like this that are uncomfortable, but really important, right, to student experience, faculty, staff experience, can help us down the road, right? And it's just what we do afterwards, right, the actions that we take. So thank you for engaging that student question, and we'll turn it back to Dr. Fortner.
We have one more question from the audience, yes.
Okay, this is a live audience question. So, Chair Wong and Chancellor Koester, how often have you been the first, you have often been the first, resulting in your going into uncharted environments. In terms of leadership, how did you gain the knowledge, skills, and habits of mind to navigate political, structural, and volatile arenas?
Wow. I'm still working on that. If you know me, you know that I am a person who is prepared. And as I've been working myself up the ladder since I started in 1974, I made the mistake of not asking for help. You can ask for help. With colleagues, with friends, with faculty, with staff, with your community, you can ask for help. Because what I did was I just was very observant. I taught myself. I didn't know how to produce a show. I was hired to be a talk show host. I had never been on television before. What did I do? I watched television incessantly, and I picked up what I thought was positive and what was negative, and I just incorporated it. And I became very self-aware, but again, I was so prepared. And that's the reason why I made certain that for those who would follow, that I was cutting a path for them as well, clearing a pathway. So in terms of advice on that, it is just learn as much as you can. And there are so many role models available now in any aspect, any field that you want to go into. There are role models for you. And I mean, having access to the internet and online and that information, you can learn about leadership. And it really is about picking up, I mean, look at this incredible role model here. Just look at her, listen to her speak, listen to her background, and gain from that.
I would offer, in addition, those are all great words of advice, but for me, it's failure was just as important as success. I would also say a recognition that I have to constantly keep learning. I have a horoscope taped into the front of my little notebook that says, asking questions when you're confused or ignorant is really important, something like that. And my husband gave it to me on the day that I started as the interim chancellor, so I'm asking a lot of questions, and I'm willing to show ignorance frequently. And then the other thing is you have to read and study and reflect. Leadership is a journey that requires thoughtfulness and care, and a willingness to test the limits of who you are.
Thank you. Be prepared, ask for help, look for role models, ask questions, don't be afraid to say, I don't know, and be fearless. Yes? Okay, thank you. We are going to send on the other questions that we weren't able to ask you today, just so to give you a sense, right, of what people want to know. But before we go, I want to take a moment, one, to thank our audience, to thank the people who were able to join us today with their busy schedules and in between classes, as well in our live audience, and then our live streaming audience as well. Thank the president and thank VP Porter as well with a small token of appreciation. So.